Great to see all of you here. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. My name is Eric Owens, and I am the director of the International Studies program and a faculty member in the theology department here at Boston College. And it is an honor and a privilege to introduce our speaker, Professor Eric Gregory, this evening. But first, let me say a couple words about our program. This evening's lecture and conversation is sponsored by the Global Citizenships Project, an interdisciplinary effort to join theory and practice, action and reflection by connecting students, faculty, and practitioners in conversations about the nature, scope, and limits of what is frequently called global citizenship. Generously funded by BC's Institute for Liberal Arts, its hallmark is a series of action workshops for undergraduate students with practitioners from different fields around the world. And it has also hosted a lecture series like this evening, a faculty seminar, and a conference on responding to global refugee dynamics. I have just posted a link to more information about the project in the chat window if you'd like to learn more. And it's been my pleasure to direct this project for the past 3 years. And I've known from the very beginning of it that our guest this evening would be a perfect contributor to this ongoing reflection about global citizenship. After we had to cancel a planned on-campus lecture last spring, I'm delighted we could make it work virtually this evening. Thank you, Eric, for your flexibility. And I, of course, wish I could do this in person. Because we wanted to foster plenty of give and take on these big issues, I've asked Professor Gregory to speak for about a half hour this evening so we can reserve the remaining 40 minutes or so for questions and reflections from the audience. I'm delighted to have so many colleagues join us, along with several undergraduate courses, including my own senior seminar on global citizenship in theory and practice. I've opened the chat feature as well as the Q&A box. And when it's time to open for conversation, you can either raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you to speak, or you can offer a question using the Q&A feature. The chat box is a place to post links, and I see you didn't post it in the right place there. Here you go. The chat box is a place to post links or to connect on ideas that aren't going to be lifted into our spoken conversation. So now let me take a moment to introduce our speaker, and we'll be on our way. Eric Gregory is professor of religion and chair of the Council of Humanities at Princeton University, where he has taught since 2001. A graduate of Harvard College, he earned an MPhil and diploma in theology from the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and then his doctorate in religious studies from Yale University. A committed teacher of both graduate and undergraduate students, Professor Gregory has won Princeton's President's Award for distinguished teaching, and he offers courses on an array of topics in religious and philosophical ethics, Christian theology, political theory, law and religion, and the role of religion in public life. As a scholar, he's received major fellowships from the Erasmus Institute at Notre Dame, the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Tikva Center for Law and Jewish Civilization at NYU. He's published widely in scholarly books and journals, and is well known for his seminal 2008 book, Politics in the Order of Love, an Augustinian Ethic of Democratic Citizenship. He's currently at work on a new book, tentatively entitled The Ingathering of Strangers, Global Justice and Political Theology, which examines secular and religious perspectives on global justice. His talk this evening is entitled Global Citizenship and the Good Samaritan. It's an honor, a pleasure to welcome you virtually to Boston College, Eric. Thanks so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, friends, thanks to Professor Owens for that introduction and for this invitation to be a part of your Global Citizenships Project. I too regret not being able to join you in person today, partly because of the famous hospitality that I know Boston College is very good at, but also because I think embodied personal relations are an important part of education and the Catholic sacramental tradition more generally, raising questions about how they relate to technological innovations that bring distant strangers closer to us, and the dramatic rise of global religious activity since the end of the Cold War, something about which I will speak today. So my plan is to frame a few key ideas and arguments related to global engagement and global citizenship. They are among the most pressing concerns of our time, both in terms of the scope of morality and the character of our politics. One perhaps provocative way to frame our discussion would be to ask, is global citizenship Catholic? Or less abstractly, how should American Catholics understand their identity and collective responsibility in relation to what Pope Francis in his recent encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti has called the global common good, a single human family that, quote, transcends the barriers of geography and distance. I'm going to approach global citizenship primarily in relation to the dilemmas of nationalism and humanitarianism, two isms that receive a lot of criticism today, despite their appeal to many Christians. I'm going to defend partially their virtues, hoping for a better nationalism and a better humanitarianism, against what David Hollenbach has described as a pure form of cosmopolitanism that imagines we have no special duties to fellow citizens. Now, these are ancient questions, but I'm motivated by empirical claims about our world that require fresh thinking, not only about solidarity and subsidiarity, but autonomy and moral equality when thinking about what we owe strangers, as the boundaries among nations matter less and less, while they seem also to matter more and more. And my hope is to do so in ways that might help us think theologically and biblically. One way is to consider the familiar, perhaps overly familiar, biblical parable of the Good Samaritan, also the focus of Francis's letter. The outsider Samaritan's act of caring, of proving to be neighbor, is often celebrated as a boundary-crossing assault on narrow tribalism, especially ethnicity bound to religion, disrupting not only self-interest and hypocrisy, but our tendency to prefer people like us. It stands along Paul's cosmopolitan declaration in Galatians 3:28 as a hallmark egalitarian text of modern Christianity. In fact, with Matthew 25, these might be paired as the most important New Testament text for modern Christian ethics. I once thought I would write a short book on the reception of this parable, perplexed by its relative neglect in the early church. Sociologists might say it's not a good example for building in-group solidarity for fragile communities like the early church. And its near universal acclaim in our global age. The manuscript, I thought, was going to defend a Christian cosmopolitanism, grounding a universal ethics for a universal community of equal standing, a desire many secular political theorists often also aim to do by building upon Kantian or utilitarian traditions that expand the circle of moral concern in praise of global citizenship. But something happened along the way, partly because I'm not a proper historian or a good historian, but also because I became less enamored of cosmopolitanism, even Christian cosmopolitanism, and challenged by the many critics of humanitarian action today. Now, the parable was typically allegorized by the church fathers, with Jesus, the Good Samaritan, healing the sins of wounded humanity, though not without moral significance for the fathers. Interestingly, it has not been a common appeal in American religious history until recently. John Winthrop makes nothing of it in his famous account of Christian charity. Today, however, it's the rare biblical story mentioned not only by popes, but by secular philosophers, who tend to prefer thought experiments to parables, including John Rawls, Amartya Sen, and Judith Thompson. Though they read it less in terms of charity, let alone eternal life, which prompts the lawyer's initial question, but as a warrant for a rather demanding conception of justice. It's also the rare biblical story that makes its way into actual politics. One of the more famous conservative appeals came from the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher. In the heat of welfare debates, Thatcher remarked, "No one would have remembered the Good Samaritan if he only had good intentions. He had money as well." In her defense of capitalism and personal care of the Samaritan kind over against state services, follows many who argue that commercial societies expand opportunities for charity like never before. For her critics, Thatcher turned the parable into a story about being rich rather than being good. From a different angle, Martin Luther King invoked the parable to speak about the need to move beyond individual charity. The whole Jericho Road must be transformed, he called, in building the beloved community, consistent with Francis's reading of the parable in terms of social charity that unites the personal and the institutional. Even the Good Samaritan, Francis reminds us, needed to have a nearby inn that could provide the help that he personally was not able to offer. Christian communities are deeply invested in humanitarianism as expressions of borderless love for neighbors. To the ends of the earth, it's not so much ecclesial bodies, but large budget organizations such as Catholic Relief Services, as well as thousands of smaller NGOs that constitute the Christian presence around the globe today. They play an important part in what has been described as the most significant political revolution of the modern era, humanitarianism as a revolution of moral sentiment. Just last week, in a course on teaching on social sin and historical injustice, we read an article by a Catholic economist which argued that Catholic social thought acknowledges strong individual moral responsibility and liability for harm to distant others because the parable of the Good Samaritan, quote, teaches us that there are no bounds to who is a Christian neighbor. Philosophers like Charles Taylor have told long stories about why we feel stretched by this wide range of moral obligation. In his work, he expresses a lament, however, about these demands, tracing the transformation of Christian charity into a secular political project of ridding the world of suffering, or what one theologian has called continuation of Christianity by other means. With more ambivalence, anthropologist Didier Fassin argues that humanitarianism is now a new political theology of the global order that makes the intolerableness of injustice somewhat bearable. Detached from the details of the biblical narrative, including a God who has preferential loves, the parable has been ethicized and universalized. Henry Luce, in his famous essay, The American Century, summoned Americans to be, quote, the Good Samaritans of the entire world. Ironically, apart from justifying intervention in World War II, his other example, feeding the world by subsidizing American agriculture, is now seen as a prime example of harm to farmers in the global South. Caring in this way can be exhausting, paternalistic, and suffocating, as Charles Dickens satirized through the character of poor Mrs. Jellyby, who neglected her duties because he said her eyes could see nothing nearer than Africa. Interestingly, many people point to Mrs. Jellyby, particularly communitarian critics of cosmopolitanism, though recent work has shown the gendered dimensions of these criticism in relation to real-life abolitionists and emancipationists in the period, who were said to fail in their domestic duties. But in any case, we can always do more with varying degrees of sacrifice. I don't need to tell you about Catholic guilt and telling you to do more good things. Almost 50 years ago, Peter Singer argued, from the moral point of view, the development of the world into a global village has made an important but unrecognized difference to our moral situation. The circumstances that prompted his argument have only intensified. Things were already getting more complicated when Adam Smith, David Hume, Ralph Waldo Emerson picked up the image Singer made of concentric circles expanding. For them, they were trying to awaken their readers to the ethical consequences of trade in spices, sugar, cotton, and slaves. Their social world was shrinking. They saw how sympathy extended concern for distant others, but at the same time could cause such distress that we seek to escape it. As Emerson concisely put it, the sugar that slaves raised is excellent. Nobody tastes blood in it. Our world is much smaller now, in some sense, more grim. The Good Samaritan was placed in physical proximity to a stranger in need. Our relationships to physically distant strangers are typically much more heavily freighted with wrongs. Actual political debates, such as the case with slavery, reveal this structure. Part of the argument here is that shifting notions of duty are a product of social change as we move from one type of society to another, perhaps from a status conception of the global order to a global one. One social change is mega philanthropy. We are living in a second golden age of philanthropy, at least. At $50 billion, the Gates Foundation is worth more than the GDP of many African countries. Development associated with the UN and the World Bank, which economists now tend to believe was not well spent, is met with this older yet reconfigured form of philanthropy that fuses cosmopolitanism and technology. Economists question whether aid thwarts long-term development, induces state exit, creates dependency, and contains popular discontent that might otherwise pressure political reform. My colleague, Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton argues that citizens of the rich world can best help the poor by not giving them aid. Singer's efforts, however, to render no one a moral stranger, which I find praiseworthy, seems to rely on intuitions that makes us think if we are actually all simply strangers to one another. And here's the problem. His philosophy of effective altruism promises us a procedure to give us calculations to decide if it's better to cure the blind or improve the life of AIDS patients. But all things considered, Singer's Good Samaritan might pass by on the other side of the road should she be on her way to make an important charitable donation that otherwise would not be made. It offers a single outlook that, when followed rigorously, obliterates special relationships. It's not so much a utopia, but an atopia. There's no map of the world. It doesn't keep our feet on the ground, as Pope Francis argues in trying to hold the local and the universal together. Critics of radical Samaritanism suggest moderation is necessary, even for the sake of morality. Maybe distinguishing equal respect from equal concern, or doing your fair share in support of just institutions, identifying minimal thresholds that we owe strangers, doing the hard work of casuistry in distinguishing formal and material cooperation with evil, or perfect duties of justice and imperfect duties of charity. The sorts of things that many of the moral theologians in Boston College write about. Even Singer downplays the demandingness of duties in public, but he does so for utilitarian reasons rather than what Francis called the love for one's own people. Some readings of the parable, in fact, now emphasize the significance that it was on a particular Jericho road, an actual proximity. It's often hard to say, where do we draw the line between reciprocity and holiness? Is hospitality for the persecuted refugee a matter of the golden rule or the Good Samaritan, justice or charity? Does it matter? But harsher critics of humanitarianism say this is not love. It's the mask worn by the powerful. Vincent Lloyd at Villanova University, for example, argues that white Americans donating to their favorite charity reinforces the image of non-whites as essentially sufferers, particularly in Africa, objects of charity denied shared humanity. The dilemma of humanitarianism is linked to the dilemma of nationalism. Consider, for example, Catholic theologian Emmanuel Katangale's work, The Sacrifice of Africa. Katangale argues that the humanitarian concern for, quote, poor Africans framed a vision of Africa as savage and primitive, in need of civilizing aid of European and American Christians. While the language has changed with greater concern for accountability, he argues this legacy continues in the way relief and development pervades the imagination not only for Africa, but by Africans. The church, he argues, has become just another frantic NGO in the modern nation-state imaginary, despite, or perhaps because of, repeated calls for the church to do the work of the Good Samaritan and leave politics to the nations. Katangale contrasts a top-down bureaucracy with a Eucharistic practice that highlights small-scale ministries and moral exemplars in ways that, to my mind, recall debates about the Catholic worker movement and whether or not Christian personalism can be scaled up to regional, let alone national or global orders. Perhaps that's been a topic of conversation with some of your practitioners. To the extent humanitarian work is rationalized, however, it meets Christian suspicion in the name of a desire for relationships. But to the extent humanitarian work resists professionalization, it meets empirical suspicion in the name of efficiency. Now, social historians tell us it was the preaching of Christian bishops like Augustine of Hippo that invented the category of the poor in ways that challenged narrow definitions of citizenship in his own context. Augustine affirmed equality of all peoples, but he held a pastoral wisdom about proximity. He said, quote, "You should take particular thought for those who, as if by lot, happen to be close to you in terms of place, time, or other circumstance." Proximity, in fact, has been linked to divine providence in the distribution of nations with, quote, "their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands," Acts 17. In the words Of one modern Augustinian, divine providence has instituted distinct peoples with distinct identities to set limits to the pursuit of justice. Now, we know the toxic use to which this biblical passage has been put, not only in the 19th century and the 20th century, but indeed Acts 17 was cited by Robert Jeffress, the pastor who at Trump's inauguration sermon compared Trump to Nehemiah, building the walls of the nation, delivering it from bondage, America first. It's hard to read discussions of religion and politics in the United States without stumbling upon criticism of nationalism, especially white Christian nationalism. Though as an aside, interestingly, I just read a survey that shows a remarkable decline in the percentage of Americans who believe God has granted America a special role in human history, down from almost 60% in 2016 to 40% in late 2020. But there's no shortage of critics of nationalism, perhaps especially in Christian thought. But also, I think because we Americans are more comfortable with the concept of states or civic identity rather than nationhood. Since World War II, there have been few theological discussions of national identity other than loud no's. Even among those who grant nations are socially constructed and sources of idolatry. A recent Catholic theology of nationality by a Welsh Jesuit began by stating that in some circles, quote, to suggest nationality might have a spiritual value would appear as respectable as asserting that dragons exist. Now, I have young children, so I do know that dragons exist, and I'm going to partially defend this Welsh point of view. What I find interesting about our moment, however, is that the United States is negotiating tensions between liberal democracy and the need for national belonging, or what philosophers call associative duties, even as we feel the pull of something like global citizenship. America may be a nation with the soul of a church, as G.K. Chesterton famously put it, but it's hard to be a nation or a church of abstract ideas, as much as it appeals to my cosmopolitan, intellectual, professorial side, but also as someone enchanted by the Christian story of a universal kinship that Augustine used in warning Christians of his day not to baptize their Romanitas, to relativize their citizenship in the empire, because they should see the basic unity of the human race. They should look to the Jerusalem above, which Augustine in some ways thought of as a great melting pot of the eschatological kingdom that would be indifferent to nations, at least any nation besides perhaps Israel. Early Christians wrestled with the charge that they disturbed the way of classifying people. They created the category of Gentiles and then made Gentiles unintelligible by preaching equality in Christ shatters all other communities for those who have another city to love, a new covenant that gathers all people. Maybe there's not even Samaritans in heaven. The freedom of the Christian, we might say, is the freedom to renounce the claims of any naturalized community, given the infusion of the Spirit. And Francis's call to, quote, show the same care and concern that the Samaritan showed the wounded man to the farthest reaches of the world. It's a familiar picture that I see also in liberal Protestant Christianity. Adolf von Harnack claimed that Christianity burst the bounds of nationality. Rudolf Bultmann said the sacraments establish a community that transcends all nationality. And these were often presented in anti-Jewish ways, just as many medieval Catholics preached the parable of the Good Samaritan in ways that contrasted the narrow legalism of Judaism and the boundless universal love of Catholicism. The problem is there's a lot of nation talk in the Bible. The three personae are God, the nations, and Israel. In the Hebrew Bible, we find prophetic visions of God bringing justice to the nations. By emphasizing the Jewishness of Jesus, recent literature challenges any simple thesis that Christianity is universal and Judaism is particular. Denise Kimber-Buell, for example, has argued that the notion of a Christian erasure of nationality is not tenable historically or scripturally. According to Buell, even well-meaning universalism faces what she calls a troubling ethical paradox. that valorizes non-ethnic universal Christianity against ethnic particular Judaism. Later Christian traditions, to varying degrees, adopted this corporate language. There are nearly 4,000 references to different peoples in Augustine's corpus, even some assigning so-called angels to different peoples. And I noted in the encyclical letter that Francis invoked God's, quote, providential plan for the nations. Yet the prophets also portray the nations as a mere drop in the bucket, a little dust on the scales of divine judgment. The defeated nations count for nothing, Isaiah says, from the perspective of eternity. But when God gathers all flesh before the divine presence, it is as nations that they assemble. St. Paul's mission as apostle to the Gentiles wasn't to include the Gentiles in this Jewish story, a Jewish national story. A classical Protestant view is that nations are governed by providence, but they are not part of salvation history. They are temporal, not eternal or supernatural. God saves individuals, not peoples. In time, however, we live in social bodies that form distinct vocations with complicated relations to ethnicity, race, language, history, and culture. I don't have to tell you that some of the most controversial issues today, immigration, healthcare, public education, climate change, religious liberty, national symbols, foreign policy, reveal this complexity. The feet of countless migrants blur the same boundaries that financial capital leaps over in a single bound, causing some theologians today to invoke a right to nationality, or even someone like John Rawls to speak in frank terms about nations as bulwarks against the capitalist business class. While often framed in terms of a cosmopolitan left against a nationalist right, there's a growing archive of so-called liberal nationalism. Patriotism is animated by love, nationalism by hatred, according to Jill Lepore in her recent book, This America, The Case for the Nation. Or as the Second Vatican Council maintained, citizens must cultivate a generous and loyal spirit of patriotism, but without being narrowly minded. I guess I'm cheering for that archive, call it liberal patriotism, that might respond to the polarization that afflicts our society today. But patriotism is not quite the same thing as an ethic of nations, let alone a theology of nationhood. Like many mid-20th century Christians, you can think of John Courtney Murray or Reinhold Niebuhr, I limit my nationalism by internationalism. By definition, internationalists value the life world of nations, even if they are not valued absolutely. Niebuhr, for example, was a staunch critic of American nationalism and a realist supporter of the United Nations. But he also held that, quote, what lies beyond the nation, the community of mankind, is too vague to inspire devotion. Global citizenship, he might say, is an impossible possibility, a useful illusion. Of course, there have been efforts to make this practical. After World War II, University of Chicago President Robert Hutchinson recruited no less an authority than Thomas Aquinas to support a world state to solve the problem of war. Alas, that hope was not to be. As much as the global order has changed and is changing, perhaps even back to a neo-medieval world of legal pluralism and multi-layered governance, we seem to be still in something like a post-Westphalian system of nation states as the best vehicle for democratic political action, made vivid by our pandemic that has stressed international cooperation, but revealed the continued salience of states and humanitarian action. Many concrete proposals for global justice, an aggressive carbon tax, elimination of resource privileging and international trade, invite potentially radical reforms. But to my mind, it's not clear they issue a deep challenge to the international structure or the fact that nations have a special responsibility for the lives of their own people. Whether imagined or not, nations have not disappeared, and none of us live in a world where nations do not matter. Perhaps the parable meets nationalism most clearly in debates about immigration. By my lights, most of these appeals are insufficiently political. They announce moral principles like the dignity of the undocumented, that provide no actual political guidance. They often imply an open borders policy that few actually defend, especially in democratic societies that place moral significance in collective self-governance, even as they raise a host of empirical questions about wage deflation or ecological doom. For liberal internationalists, open borders would abolish homelands, something that many elites might like, but as Michael Walzer has put it, would turn life into a long series of hotel rooms. I think states have a right to exclude, but this doesn't mean they're required to exercise this right. In fact, like personal ethics, political morality is not exhausted by considerations of justice. This puts me at odds with many theologians and religious activists. They desire justice, not charity. I'm sympathetic to this charge. I don't want to think in terms less than justice. But to use some philosophical jargon, I believe migrants have a right to migrate, but it is an imperfect right, held against humanity collectively, rooted in the common possession of earth. The problem is, it's not clear who owes satisfaction of that right. Does it solicit an individual duty that a migrant can make a claim on me, or something like a demand to build just institutions that are responsive to these kinds of imperfect rights? Hard distinctions will have to be made, perhaps not unlike the range of variegated relations in the Bible, but now between asylum seekers, non-citizen spouses, economic migrants. On what grounds? Charity and justice, concretely sorting out different relationships and complicated histories. Effective altruists, like my friend and colleague Peter Singer, are wrong to suggest that the only relevant moral facts are the suffering of distant strangers and the ability to help. Augustine was right to emphasize that we belong to social bodies of various kinds with histories and geographies. To think properly about what we owe to whom is to think relationally. Call this relational internationalism and relational humanitarianism, a relational point of view from somewhere, a mutual belonging in difference. Let me draw things to an end. Awareness of global suffering threatens to overwhelm us as we struggle today to discern responsibility given increased sensitivity to large-scale, deeply historical, systemic injustices that solicit our moral outrage, often without clear relation to individual moral agents, such as those exposed by Black Lives Matter. Sin begets tragedy, even in those relationships we inherit through no fault of our own or in our capacity as group members, say as Americans in relation to Mexicans, or coming to terms with our university's relationship to slavery, something which my university is doing as well as I know your own. We benefit from various relationships, and in reaping these benefits, become increasingly complicit in them. The novel moral challenge of globalization seems the difficulty of sorting out these relationships, ones that are often highly indirect and diffuse, both in terms of backward-looking justice that traces causal responsibility for harm, but forward-looking responsibility that tends to our capacity to care for others, to think about responsibility and remediation without always turning to guilt, all the while keeping our feet on the ground. We occupy different positions in the parable most of our lives. We are Samaritans, we are thieves, we are wounded. It's a morally shameful condition that's met with lament and repentance in the Catholic liturgy. But it's also a call to action and imagination, even perhaps finding in opportunities for global engagement, a blessing to journey with God and neighbor, lest we pass by on the other side through paralyzing despair, prophetic anger that leads nowhere, or just mild guilt about the state of the world. In his provocative book, The Ethics of Memory, Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit defends a relational approach as well, but he contrasts what he calls the Christian project that seeks a universe of ethical relations for humanity at large, betraying what he thought was the origin of Christianity in the thickness of Judaism, moored in shared memory, focused on the near and dear, I was thinking about this book recently when my university changed its informal motto from "in the service of the nation" to "in the service of all nations," and now from Sonia Sotomayor's speech, "in the service of humanity." Augustine deferred the dream of a world of complete intimacy with all humanity for another time. It would be a time, he says, when the thoughts of each of us are made manifest to all. Now, that can be pretty scary, especially on a Zoom webinar, but we don't live in this time yet. Theologian Stanley Hauerwas famously argued that the problem of Christianity in America is that its subject has been America rather than God. But the late Catholic thinker Richard John Newhouse said that when he meets God, he expects to meet him as an American, because the story of America is part of the story of God's world. A theology of nations can be risky, triumphalistic, morally narrow, especially perhaps when hitched to a strange humanitarian concept that there are things we ought to do but are not required to do. But it might also humble Christian thought by coming clean about finite sources of identity as peoples who have to think wisely about being earthbound creatures. Now, this is all far from what must be said, and I've only wanted to lay some things on the table, but it's enough, perhaps more than enough, for a webinar late in the spring semester, late on a beautiful spring day. But I look forward to our conversation, to questions and comments that anyone might have.
Thank you so much, Eric. What a rich tableau of concepts and challenges we have in front of us, and touching on both Catholic and non-Catholic approaches, nationalism, humanitarianism, global citizenship, so much. This is you've spread a terrific table for us. And we have a range of people here today with us, with some with broad interests and others with very technical expertise as well. And so we welcome all sorts of questions. As I put in my chat, if you'd like to speak your question, we would welcome that. And just raise your hand using the raise hand feature at the bottom of the Zoom box. Otherwise, you can also put text questions in, and I'll pose those to Professor Gregory in time, and we'll alternate between the two. I'd like to emphasize that we especially encourage students to pitch in questions, and that the conversation is again broad and non-exclusive and non-technical, so big questions, simply put, or longer questions are all welcome. So thanks. Let's start with Miran Sergeyev, who put in the Q&A box, who asked, to what extent is your liberal internationalism, Professor Gregory, fundamentally anti-cosmopolitan, insofar as it advocates for state-based identity and some conception of one's fatherland? Is that clear, Eric?
Yes, thanks so much. I noted that my former colleague Anthony Appia probably gave a lecture on a similar theme with your project. And I think I share what he has called rooted cosmopolitanism. So what I share the notion of cosmopolitanism as a kind of moral vision that gives dignity to all people, but resist it as a kind of political ideal towards which we must regret not embodying through a world government, or even through increasing authority given to transnational actors. So this gets to questions about democratic deficit that political theorists talk about. But also, I'm not sure I would call mine state-based. I'm still working through this to my mind because of what I was saying about the nations. I think there are stateless nations that create borders of identity and collective responsibility within their group. So yeah, it's hard because my own kind of nationalism is sometimes called civic nationalism. It's not rooted in ethnicity, although I've always been struck that the only theologians I saw writing about nationalism tend to be from many movements for self-determination. So the Welsh, the Scottish, some in Africa, and others. So yes, my liberal internationalism is anti-cosmopolitanism in a political sense, not in a moral sense. And it has a kind of civic nation state valence. And like many since World War II, I kind of been haunted by the specter of the fatherland. But I think liberal internationalists need to learn how to talk about nations.
Great, thanks so much. Our next question comes from Professor Steve Pope, who says, ought not the duty to satisfy the right to migrate be scaled to the wealth and power of a country? The vast majority of refugees are hosted by relatively poor countries in their own neighborhood, for example, Syrians living in Jordan. You would seem to want to strongly increase our admission of refugees. How do you think we ought to relate the ethical imperative to meet the dire needs of refugees to the strictures of what is perceived to be politically feasible?
Yeah, thanks very much, Professor Pope. Good, hard question. I agree that one aspect of realizing the duty to satisfy this right is scaled to the wealth and power and opportunities of countries. And I do think that other countries are doing a much better job of hosting refugees from poor countries. It gets empirically difficult. I know some have argued, for example, that the greater admission of refugees into Germany led to a kind of backlash and the rise of a kind of ethnic nationalism that I find, morally and politically offensive. So I don't think there's a clear kind of procedure. I think we just need to balance, as the question suggests, partly in deference to political feasibility, but also not kind of assume political feasibility. And we need to kind of make an argument, particularly for refugees, which I might distinguish from other types of migrants, and precisely on the grounds of the parable of the Good Samaritan, which still has a certain sway in American public rhetoric. Although I increasingly have students in my classes who ask me, who is the Good Samaritan? What is the parable of the Good Samaritan? So that biblical literacy is fraying. Yeah, so I think also the other question the other answer I hinted at in my talk is that I don't think there's just an abstract formula. It has to do with historical questions of relationship. Now, the problem is, given American foreign policy, we have historical relationships with many, many, many countries. So I highlighted our relationship, say, with Mexico, given its geographic proximity, also our policies that have encouraged migrants to come. But in thinking about the examples of Syria and other Middle Eastern countries, I think our military activities also triggers responsibility. Yes, I would kind of agree with the question.
Great, thanks so much. Let's take a question from a student, Christopher Sundaram. He says, I'm interested in this idea that what lies beyond the nation is too vague to inspire devotion. Isn't the concept of the nation quite vague, however? Furthermore, due to the familial cultural ties to nations across the world that so many people have nowadays, do you think the idea of a global community is actually becoming more concrete? Many people seem to be connected and, quote, devoted to places outside their own nation.
Yeah, terrific. I think sometimes the debate about global justice is often framed in terms of, well, we have a social contract with our fellow citizens that has a stronger sense of identity. But then I think about, America is a pretty big place. So why is it that I think my relationship to somebody who lives in Texas has a kind of moral salience that my relationship to somebody in Indonesia, perhaps with whom I am buying coffee and kind of exchanging goods and having this relationship, why does that matter? I guess as a kind of liberal Democrat, I do think there is something to be said for the kind of boundedness of our social contract that we have with fellow citizens. despite the kind of imaginary relationship I might have with a Texan. Part of that, I think civic nationalism has a complicated relationship to cultural nationalism. There are kind of holidays, festivals, stories we tell, and the big debate we're having about what it means to be an American. Is it about the 1619 Project? Is it about the 1776 Project? All of those things do create bonds of solidarity that I think do have this. But the idea of a global community is becoming more concrete, partly through technology, social media, partly through migration. People maintain ties, there's flows across nations. And again, I'm not a nationalist who's jealously protective of national identity. I'm an internationalist who wants to have more and more experiments with transnationalism. I guess I'm still not sure we're there where there's enough integration that actually would sponsor something like the erosion of the kind of architecture of duties that we have to fellow nationals versus others.
Great, thanks. We have a question from Professor Kristen Heyer, who works on migration issues. She says, thanks so much, Eric. What role should nations' histories of engagement across borders play in determining relative duties of reception, per recent work by Saskia Sassen, or even those like Suketu Mehta, who conceives of migration as reparations? How would relational nationalists guard against the dangers of nationalism we've witnessed in recent years? So pushing a little bit further on some of the issues you've already spoken about.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I often use Professor Heyer's work in my classes at Princeton on many of these issues. Yeah, so I guess maybe that's where I talk about distinguishing maybe duties of justice and demands of charity. In some cases, the question of migration involves charity. But I think particularly as this work suggests, and as I was talking about in terms of our historical entanglements with different countries, I do think it is appropriate to think about migration policy in terms of moral repair, reparations even. And it's interesting to me, and partly I was thinking about this in relation to the histories of slavery that our university is thinking about. I think Catholic thought offers a lot of resources for conceiving of these legacies of the past that are no longer past and still with us. But I actually have a hard time when I talk to a lot of my fellow liberal political theorists, because they have such a kind of individualistic conception of history, and without much recourse, they'll talk about structures of justice, but the historical relationships get kind of fuzzy. I think that's where a lot of the debate about reparations, maybe the Catholic social thinking could contribute to that kind of work that Professor Heyer mentioned. I think it's really hard to know what that actually means for a policy, given again the reparations that are many.
Yeah, thanks so much. Stephanie Robinson asks, in recent times, young people have united in quote unquote community aid and other small scale deregulated methods of giving and sharing, as opposed to traditionally structured large charities. How might this relate to the broader movements in Christian aid or charity that you spoke about?
Yeah, I've gotten quite interested in those. I kind of hinted at it again with the aside I made about the Catholic worker movement, for example. And also, I started interviewing a lot of leaders of large faith-based NGOs. And what was striking to me was that many of them sort of had their degrees from the Kennedy School of Government, had worked for McKinsey, and had worked for other large organizations. Now, they may have been people of faith or that informed their motivations, but these large-scale organizations often find it hard to kind of replicate those kinds of activities that Stephanie Robinson mentions. In fact, some small Catholic charities consciously resist forms of rational planning or professional philanthropy as a sign of trust in God. And some have argued that small-scale charities do a better job at offering deeper-rooted, longer-lasting change because they often incorporate indigenously led communities where there's a kind of effective agency for recipients of aid. They often employ religious language in ways the large-scale religious NGOs don't, that speak to questions about moral behavior that some of the large-scale NGOs don't touch for fear of cultural imperialism. I think my question is still, while I'm attracted to that, can it scale up to the kinds of services that the larger scale agencies and aids organizations are able to deliver? And, I'm coming at this partly as somebody who took time off of graduate school to do development work in Africa and has kind of always been slightly haunted by that. I'm not by any means a professional or an economist or an anthropologist, but I'm deeply inspired by many people who do that work. It's just when I started to read the ethical and theological literature, it was very critical of the humanitarian work. But I think there might sometimes be a false romance with the smaller scale. And we've also seen the horrific moral consequences of the lack of bureaucracy. So in some ways, I'm giving 2 cheers for nations, 2 cheers for humanitarianism, and maybe 2 cheers for bureaucracy, that these smaller scale charities, while they are very relationally sensitive, this is in some ways the question about modern social science, because a lot of the early Christians committed to social science were people who wanted to bring their faith-based commitments to a larger scale and to kind of use statistics and use economic analysis to deliver more effective aid. But that's the dilemma I mentioned.
Great, thanks. Let's go to student Brianna Stonek, who asks, going off of the parable of the Good Samaritan, how would you incorporate the idea of God's love for and solidarity with the marginalized in the setting of global nationalism? How can this idea of Christian charity be applied to nationalism versus universalism?
Yeah. Well, this raises another one of those tough questions that hard-headed analytic moral philosophers sometimes ask about, do we owe more to African Americans, given the history of the United States, than we might for extending our care beyond the United States? And there's a kind of forcing you to have moral triage and making difficult choices. I do, think that, as I mentioned, Matthew 25 and many of the biblical stories that we could pair with the parable of the Good Samaritan do put a preferential option for the poor. And there's long-standing debates about whether that means we should focus on the neediest or the needy who are nearby. And again, I don't have a calculus here. It might sound too much like giving over to the nebulous dictates of charity. But I think that would be another criteria we might include to look at the histories of marginalization, to think about. And even as we're aware of that also playing into what the critics of humanitarianism remind us, that scripts us as the Good Samaritans saving the suffering world and in depriving others of agency. So I think we just have to be careful of those entanglements.
Thanks so much. Speaking of biblical references here, Professor Mara Willard says, I'm thinking of Luke 8:19 through 21. She says, I had to Google that, the Catholics. Here, Jesus seems to renounce the particular. That's Luke 8:19 through 21. Here, Jesus seems to renounce the particular for the universal. My question is about gender and intergenerational obligations, Monica's role for Augustine. The renunciation, ? Of Mary by Jesus, but the reality of the Marthas of the world, both in the Catholic and Protestant tradition, but also in the late capitalist age, those of us that are sons and daughters. Open-ended opportunity to reflect on that.
Yeah, I think in part my invocation of the Galatians 3 passage, which I know all Boston College undergraduates know about, there's neither male nor female in Christ. and neither Jew nor Greek. And again, this taps into kind of recent biblical interpreters who kind of said, well, actually, that wasn't just a metaphor. That was really about real Jews and real Greeks. Or the interpretation of the male and female passage has been, well, maybe in Christ, sexual or identities are kind of made not unimportant, but more indifferent than they might otherwise be. And this is, again, critical. One of my friends, Paula Fredrickson, refers to this as the Massachusetts Democrat interpretations of Galatians 3, that all of our different roles and identities are sort of indifferent. And look, this is just the Christian tradition has had a long time trying to negotiate this. And I'm not sure I can give a kind of, help me with an answer with you biblically literate Boston College people. I mean, I can't see the questions anymore. So I'm trying to, there we go. How do we think about that? I mean, the only thing I will say is there's a lot more said about nations than about nuclear families in the Hebrew Bible and the, at least in the New Testament reception of it. So I'm not sure if I have a good answer in terms of what it means for gender in terms of nationalism. And although obviously nationalism has often been hooked to a hyper-masculine notion, there's a new book called Jesus and John Wayne that looks at how American evangelical Christians have wedded militarism and nationalism to a gendered notion. But I think this gets to the temptation of a certain part of the Christian tradition that renunciates the emphasis on family and nation that it found in Judaism. This has been called supersessionism. And I think the Catholic Church and other Christian communities have been trying to figure out, how do you not be supersessionists, but still celebrate the universal dignity of all people? And so there's a kind of theological dimension that I just think a lot of these ethical debates should attend to, partly because I think that whole debate about gender and also the Gentile and the non-Gentile is a good example of how we negotiate difference and exclusion and inclusion through a Christian lens.
Thanks very much. Let's take a question from a student, Izzy Howe. She thanks you and then says her question's about open borders. You mentioned that migrants have a right to movement through common ownership of the earth, but also that nations have the right to exclude. They also have the right not to exclude then, she says, and thereby can practice what we call open borders if they choose. She says, I agree that Singer's principle is a bit extreme, but without maintaining at least a little bit of that mindset, do you believe that any nation will actually choose to waive their right to exclude others, embody the Good Samaritan, and let migrants in? It seems unlikely, but I'm interested in your thoughts.
Well, yes. I think this raises the question of whether or not having ideals and illusions and aspirations towards which we're striving is the best way to actually change societies. And maybe, there is a bit of the, Peter Singer, as I mentioned, has a sort of, he's a good preacher. He has one very morally demanding view, but then he kind of softens it a bit because he doesn't want to overwhelm you. And it's, different countries have lots of practices of inclusion. If you look at European countries, to a certain extent, if you look at the history of the United States over the past 50 years, raising all sorts of empirical questions about different communities of migrants. But I do think maybe, there is a kind of, this would just be a political judgment. Does the emphasis on welcoming the stranger, the preaching of the parable of the Good Samaritan, the kind of openness to the other, does that, will that create a healthier political society and meet the needs of many migrants? Or, and this gets back to one of the initial questions, will this lead to a kind of backlash that will actually lead to worse things? I mean, maybe because I sometimes am a pessimist who thinks that when we aim too high, we sink below justice.
Great, thanks. Let's take Lizzie Johnson's question here. She said she's a senior working on a paper attempting to outline a framework for ethical international volunteering and is asking whether that's even possible. This builds on some of your reflections earlier. She said, your talk gave me a lot to think about. Are there criteria that you would think would be necessary for an instance of that, for such things to be ethical, or is this not possible?
Yeah, I was trying, particularly at the end, not to just leave us depressed. I mean, I share the notion that everything is dangerous, but that doesn't mean that everything is bad. In fact, I was trying to, relative to a lot of the literature on international volunteering, trying to give a kind of more positive hopefulness. So I think there are different criteria. I think the emphasis again on relationality, where one listens to the communities with which you're engaging. I was struck, one of the effective altruists that is very prominent and has done, in some sense, very morally committed, great intentions. But he told me they no longer talk to the communities of people they're trying to help because those people don't know what they need. And it's almost like a perfect example of what I find to be the kind of dangers of thinking of ourselves as the experts. So I think a lot of NGOs are trying to do more of this. I think there's still, and I don't know where this debate stands at Boston College, but I know a lot of Protestant churches have been having debates about the limits of short-term missions. That bring people overseas, expose them to often in life transformative ways, but have bad consequences or can have bad consequences. But yet I suspect Boston College still participates in a lot of programs in various parts of the developing world. I think the kind of transparency, relationality, even efficiency. I'm not saying efficiency is a bad thing, but I think all of those can be considered in the context of international volunteering.
Great, thanks so much. We do have time for some other questions if you'd like to raise your hand or add some in the Q&A box. I'd like to toss a question here that's pretty broad, but references your interest in solutions that are insufficiently political, Eric, that you mentioned earlier. In coming out of an era, well, maybe not even out of an era, at a time less than 100 days after the Trump presidency, when nuance and subtlety in our national moral dialogue was pretty flattened out and separated into camps of, good American, bad American, or us and them, et cetera. I wonder how you approach the idea of the possibility of nuance and complexity in political discourse around these questions of moral obligation. The idea of globalism and global citizenship and internationalism have taken a thorough beating in our political discourse. How do we return to a conversation around such things in a nuanced way that doesn't fall prey to straw men or to, easy pigeonholing by political opponents, that doesn't allow the moral importance and subtlety of it to move forward?
Yeah. And part of this may also be generational, Professor Owens, though we're of a similar generation. And I think it's maybe coming of age in the 1980s and 1990s, where there was still a kind of enthusiasm for international law, constitutional democracy, the discourse of human rights, that played a very important part in the 20th century. And was once hailed as the great fruit of an early modern Christian imagination, but now has been kind of rightly questioned given the legacies of inequality and historical injustices and race and colonialism. One of the things I've always appreciated about the Catholic tradition is the kind of way it's able to do distinction making and to do casuistry, And in some ways, it reminds me a little bit of some of the sermons I grew up hearing about how the lawyer in the parable was this bad person who was just trying to like get off the hook, and or even worse, as I mentioned, the kind of Jew who only wanted to have a very rabbinically narrowed notion of morality. Whereas in fact, I've kind of come to appreciate, look, the lawyer's asking our hard question: who is my neighbor in this world? And sort of, I know Professor Kathy Caveney has talked a lot about prophecy without contempt, and to kind of borrow the wisdom of the Christian tradition without sort of demonizing your opponent or others. And I think that's a lesson that we see in the public world, sometimes also in the academic world. These are really hard questions. But I think trying to kind of recognize that the institutions we've inherited are tainted with sin. But they were also the products of former generations trying to imagine alternatives to their own world. So in a way, for as much as I think it's possible to give prophetic denouncements, and we need them, particularly of the evils of nationalism, of racism, of many of the things I'm sure people on this Zoom share, but also to kind of recognize that we also need more than prophets. We need some rabbis. We need some distinctions. We need the kind of contribution of the hard work of moral theology, of social science, to kind of help us think about this, but without losing the spirit of the kind of creativity that led to these invention of social practices that we call humanitarianism and multilateral organizations. I think the current generation is kind of, if I include myself in that, is facing this kind of global moment where all sorts of cultural ideals are in flux. We're reckoning with histories. We are trying to imagine a different world. And I think we can kind of learn from the past in doing that, but it's going to create, it's going to require some moral imagination and some political savvy.
Great. We have one or two more questions we can try to take before we wrap up at 7:45 as promised. Student Grace Kavanaugh asked about, she says, you focus mostly on global citizenship in the context of Christianity and the Good Samaritan. Is there a possibility of a global common good or global citizenship that's not based on religion? I'm wondering whether you think also any sort of universal ethic is possible without, or perhaps with, a religious foundation. Obviously huge questions, but right at the center of your project here.
Yeah. Yeah, I've written I mean, I hate when people say this, but I've written a little bit about this, and particularly an article on religious pluralism and the love commands. But I think that is also one of our key questions. By focusing on the Good Samaritan, I wasn't saying that there are no other resources for thinking about these questions. And in fact, I think there's a lot of overlap with other traditions. And in part, my kind of conversation with secular thinkers was, while not based on another religion, kind of suggesting that there might be some attraction. And many people have been attracted to this parable, despite my also lifting up some of its tensions with Jewish-Christian relations. Whether, I think I would distinguish it between, to my mind, a universal ethic requires a religious foundation. But I don't think that means that others can't try their best to ground a universal ethic in a non-religious foundation. And particularly given, my views on diversity and pluralism for a political society, I certainly don't think we need a shared ethical theory. That just seems ludicrous. I don't think we will have a shared ethical theory, and I don't think history shows we need one. There have been coalitions in the past between Christians and non-Christians to address all sorts of problems, of major problems: abolitionism, women's rights, all sorts of other things. So I think maybe we can take some hope also in that.
Yeah, thanks so much. Let's take one last question from Professor Lisa Cahill. She asks, she says, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis defines the major obstruction to action on climate change as a lack of political will. i.e. sinful self-interest. You could read the parables as aesthetic and narrative attempts to create and engage solidarity and to motivate action on behalf of quote unquote the poor. How would you address the problem of political will within your framework, or perhaps change the moral imagination?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Cahill. In fact, I was also just teaching her book on global justice and Christian ethics so last week as well. I mean, in part, that's what attracts me to turning to the parable, because of a more general interest in motivating political will, and also because I think stories matter. And narratives. I mean, look, I don't think the parable of the Good Samaritan gives us answers, as I've kind of hinted at. But I think it is richer than the more stripped down, bare philosophical trolley problem literature that most philosophy and political theory does. So I'm interested in the category of parables. What are those parables doing? They can be banal and simple, but I think there's a reason why this parable has captured the moral imagination and has motivated many people to act on behalf of the poor, for all the skepticism and concerns I have about the use of this parable. So I think there's so few narratives of this kind in our kind of common collective memory, whether it's just within the Christian community, but also transcending that, there's a reason why King's invocation of the parable was compelling to many from across different class backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. And, I think that's one reason Pope Francis used it also in the recent encyclical. So yes, I think part of my interest here is not just giving, I think I'm interested in the political analysis and the moral analysis, but I'm also just interested at the end of the day, how do things change? And sometimes that's through the hard political work. Sometimes it's hard. I think philosophy matters. But I think if we think about this vast world of Christian NGOs and Christian communities, it's rooting it in biblical texts and stories like the Good Samaritan that still have this kind of fascination and capacity to motivate action.
Well, I have one final question with 1 minute left, and that is, when can we all order your book and start reading the full version of your argument that you've teased us with this evening?
Well, that's the most anxiety-producing.
Sorry, that's the hardest question of all.
Right? Question, yes. Well, coming to an end as chair of the humanities this summer, and hoping to finish up this book soon, maybe hopefully by the time we can be in person, I'll be able to have it, at least the manuscript ready.
That's terrific. Your work is inspiring to so many of us and a part of our own classroom teaching as well here at Boston College. And, you've shown again how rich your thought is and how capacious your reach is. And the project that you've taken on is really quite ambitious. And I really look forward to reading its full exposition there. And also, of course, Professor Gregory is widely published on all sorts of topics, and you can head to his website, his bio page at Princeton for a long list of his articles if you'd like to read more as you wait for his next book to come out. Thank you, Eric, so much for.
Can I just say also that since this is very much a book in process, I certainly welcome any collective contributions that you might have following up on the kinds of talks, kinds of ideas I was presenting today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time and for the scholarly work you do as well. Thank all of you for being here. We had a terrific audience and really happy to have the engagement. We'll have further information up on the Global Citizenship Project's website, and we look forward to having you attend more of those in the future. Thank you all and have a great evening.